All right, so today is May 22nd, 2016, and we are in the Feast of Second Unleavened Bread, or the second Feast of Unleavened Bread. So let us ask our Heavenly Family to guide us as we continue to study. Heavenly Family, Todah, thank you so very much for everything that you're doing for us. Thank you for guiding us to study the community rule. It is truly a blessing. Help us tonight to see the truth of, there's certain questions that we have. Help us to find the answers and help us to gain a coherent understanding of what the community rule teaches and to judge it according to the principles of truth and righteousness. So please do guide us and bless all the branches and branch candidates and those who have an opportunity to hear the message. Thank you, Heavenly Family. Please send angels to the homes of each person who is on the call tonight. Help us all to work together in cooperation with you and the other heavenly intelligences in order to bring this to be the best meeting that it can be. Todah Achoti. Guide us. We ask these things v'shem tzemach. Amen. I'll mention to you guys too, I said Todah Achoti in case anyone here is unfamiliar with Achoti. I think most people are familiar with the word Todah, thank you, or thanks. And Achoti is my sister. All right. So we've been looking at the community rule, and the last part that we were discussing last night was from 1QS. Let's see here. 1QS, column 3, line 9. 9 or so. And in Guy Vermet's translation, it says, "And when his flesh is sprinkled with purifying water and sanctified by cleansing water, it shall be made clean by the humble submission of his soul to all the precepts of God." The translation in it, my own investigation of this, looking at other translations and comparing it with the Hebrew text, seems like a more accurate translation is as follows. "By the humble submission of his soul to all the laws of God, his flesh is cleansed by being sprinkled with purifying water and made holy with the waters of repentance." So we know for sure that it's talking about humble submission and that being the means of cleansing, but we were asking the question, when it's talking about water here, is this referring to metaphorical water? Is it using a metaphor to refer to the Spirit or the truth or something like that? And we know earlier it definitely did refer to sins being wiped away by the Spirit of uprightness and humility and by the Holy Spirit uniting him to his truth, different things like that. So we know that that's an idea that the community rule definitely does teach, but we're seeking to find out if it is also teaching that there's some sort of ritual washing that takes place when someone enters the community, and is that what is being spoken of in this passage? So I hope that at least some people here have had some time to look into it a little bit more. So I'll ask first if anyone has, and if you have, please do share what you found.
I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it seemed like about every religion has some form of it, whether it's the Baha'i faith or Hindus or whoever. And that's about as far as I got.
Okay, sure. Yeah, but it is a common thing, ritual washing. Yeah.
I wasn't specifically looking for this, but I was just reading in 2 Kings today, just randomly. And I was just reading this story about Naaman and his little maid servant, and how he had leprosy, and Elisha told him to dip 7 times in the Jordan River, and he got really mad. You know the story. But, he was like, oh, I can wash in any river, Why do I need to wash in that river? And so anyway, his servants were like, well, you should just try it. So he did it, and of course he got cured from leprosy, which I don't know if that's, a type of cleansing from sin. I know leprosy is representative of sin and washing, but I don't know if that has to do with anything. But
yeah, well, hey, it's definitely a washing, and even though, in the story, I don't remember it emphasizing ritual purity things, but that would, for any ancient reader, ritual purity would be certainly implied, because if someone has leprosy or a skin disease, they are ritually impure. And so he would definitely be cleansed of that impurity by being cleansed of the leprosy. Of course, in the Israelite system, if someone was cleansed of their skin disease, they would have to then still go through more rituals in order to be ritually clean, but one layer of the uncleanness was basically present because of the leprosy itself. So taking away the leprosy effectively takes away one layer of the ritual uncleanness. So that's, definitely something that would be implied. Anyone else?
I found something just a page or so over in the community rule that I thought was interesting. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, because my phone was goofing up here. Anyway, it's column 4, about line 20, and it says, God will then purify every deed of man with his truth. He will refine for himself the human frame by rooting out all spirit of injustice from the bounds of his flesh. He will cleanse him of all wicked deeds with the spirit of holiness. Like purifying waters, he will shed upon him the spirit of truth, of all abomination and injustice, and he shall be plunged into the spirit of purification. Anyway, to me that sounded like the waters being used as a metaphor.
I would certainly agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, in this instance, clearly speaking of water metaphorically, at least as it's put in this translation. I don't know if it was translated slightly differently, if that would change, but it seems, when I looked at this before, this part definitely seems to, in the various ways that it could be translated, it looks like it's referring to waters metaphorically in any case. So then the follow-up question to that, though, is, does that mean that the waters in the previous passage are metaphorical waters?
Not necessarily.
I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. Not necessarily.
But it does show.
Yeah.
It does show, though, that it's in his style of writing to do that. So it certainly shows that it could be.
Sure. Yeah. It shows that it's an idea that is certainly present there. And the idea of the Spirit being represented by waters and things like that, and truth being represented by waters, is throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I think that it has potential. Like it's definitely a part of the picture that does inform how we ought to understand this. Not to say, like you guys said, and I agree, not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean that. Because the other aspect is, well, we know that ancient Jews all ancient Jews had non-metaphorical, well, in one sense it's a metaphor still, but they had literal water rituals. They had water rituals for cleansing. And, as I mentioned last night, the teacher of righteousness, according to the Habakkuk Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, was a priest. And if he was a priest, then he himself certainly would have been engaged in water purification rituals. So that shows us that both ideas would be at least present going back to the beginning of the community. What it is referring to here is, I guess, it's still, a little bit up in the air with the information that we've discussed so far. But that may end up leading it, depending on what other information is there, that's a part that may end up leaning in the direction of being metaphorical. Any other comments? Okay. There were a couple things that I found in looking into this. One is actually a little bit earlier. And in fact, the paragraph just before the one that we are looking at. It's referring again to the person who refuses to enter the covenant so that he may walk in the stubbornness of his heart. In, line 4 of column 3, it says, "He shall not be reckoned among the perfect. He shall neither be purified by atonement, nor cleansed by purifying waters, nor sanctified by seas and rivers, nor washed clean with any ablution." So there you have the fact that if someone is walking in the stubbornness of their heart, refusing to enter the covenant, despising the laws of God, they cannot be made clean by any purifying waters, seas, rivers, or any ablution. And then the kind of transition in the discussion is that it goes from, okay, someone refuses and he will be unclean for as long as he despises all the laws of God, refusing to be instructed in the council of, or in the community of his counsel. And the reason why is because it is through the Spirit of true counsel concerning the ways of man that he is cleansed of his sins. And then it says, he shall be cleansed from all his sins by the Holy Spirit uniting him to his truth, so on and so forth, by the humble submission of his soul to all the laws of God. His flesh is cleansed by being sprinkled with purifying water and made holy with waters of repentance. Well, one of the things there is, if it is referring to literal water in the first instance, when it says that the person who refuses cannot be cleansed by purifying waters, nor sanctified by seas and rivers, nor washed clean by any ablution, then it could be, so it's saying someone who refuses cannot be made clean by these things. And then it's switching to someone who does not refuse, someone who will be cleansed, and then it uses water language again. So it seems as though that might kind of lean in the direction of water actually being involved. Perhaps it's not certain. There's more factors that need to be looked at and understood. And I think that there's probably more than what I found. There's some more things that I'll share with you guys, but there's probably more than what I found that might help to give us a more definite answer. But this might lean in that direction. However, even just right now in reading again the translation that I have written down here, saying, his flesh is cleansed by being sprinkled with purifying water and made holy with the waters of repentance. The phrase waters of repentance seems a little bit more open to a metaphorical reading than to a literal reading. However, it could go both ways, but it seems more open to a metaphorical interpretation. But that's just one way of translating this. Most translations don't have waters of repentance. So we'll perhaps come back to that. Another thing that I found is a little bit later in the community rule, in column 5, line, I think this is around line 13. And this is talking about, I'd have to read the context again. Okay, it's talking about the men of unrighteousness, or the men of injustice. And it says, they are not reckoned in his covenant. They have neither inquired nor sought after him concerning his laws, that they might know the hidden things in which they have sinfully erred, and matters revealed they have treated with insolence. Therefore wrath shall rise up to condemn, and violence shall be executed by the curses of the covenant, and great chastisements of eternal destruction shall be visited on them, leaving no remnant. And now this is the kind of more relevant part. They shall not enter the water in order to partake of the pure meal of the men of holiness, for they shall not be cleansed unless they turn from their wickedness. For all who transgress his word are unclean. Okay, so there you have the idea that those who are in wickedness shall not enter the water in order to partake of the pure meal of the men of holiness. So I'll ask you guys, does that, in this instance, does it look like it's referring to literal water or metaphorical water?
I'd say literal.
Yeah, to me it comes across literal as well. Anyone else?
Literal.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. Yeah, it's that part, it talks about entering the water, and it's kind of in connection with a meal. And so kind of one of the questions that I have about this is this talking about having a certain washing at the beginning, which then from that point on, you're eligible to take part in the meals? Or is this talking about ritual washing prior to every meal? Josephus, he speaks of the Essenes and talks about washing before meals, and it seems as though, at least in his day, they were washing before every meal. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the community rule is saying, because the community rule was written, almost 200 years before the time of Josephus. So that, one does not necessarily reflect the other. But it shows that there's something there along those lines. Let's see here. I'm just going to see if there's any other. I have some notes here where I wrote down some references.
The water pouring ceremony was quite a special thing to them. I forget which feast it was with, or whether it was a feast of its own.
I think you're thinking of the Feast of Tabernacles, possibly, where they would pour water in one trough and wine or juice in the other trough, and they would go together and then they would mingle. Is that what you're thinking of?
I think so. I don't remember the juice, but it was a ceremony where they'd pour water and then follow it, or?
I'm pretty sure there was juice involved, or at least in the Desire of Ages, Ellen White references this. And, of course, keep in mind that none of this is in the biblical canon, Protestant canon, but it is in some extra biblical texts, and it talks about, interestingly enough, the grape juice and the water, one's poured in one tube or trough or whatever, and one's poured in the other, and then at some point they join and then they mix.
Yeah, that is the only reference to my knowledge, the only ancient reference to that ritual is from rabbinic sources. So this is later, a couple hundred years after the time of Jesus, where you had rabbis kind of reflecting back on the time period of the temple. And, so it's in the Mishnah. So I don't know if the Qumran community practiced anything like that. This is something that was done in the temple. And, so it's in the Mishnah, which is the first written form of the oral law.
Something about the water was very special to him anyway.
Yeah, water was a huge thing in terms of ritual purity in Judaism from ancient times and going on. I mean, even after the destruction of the temple, that's all they had for ritual purification. They couldn't go do sacrifices and this and that. So it, in one sense, even became more important after the temple was destroyed in 70. There's a couple references in connection with the last one that I read. So the last one talked about entering the waters in order that they might eat the pure meal. So there's another text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's called 4Q514. And in Giza Vermez's edition, it is called Ordinances or Commentaries on Biblical Law. And let's see here. I'm just seeing if his introduction includes any information about the dating of these particular manuscripts. But I don't think it does. Okay, so essentially this has, these are legal texts. So 4Q514, this is what it says. He shall not eat, ... for all the unclean, ... to count for him 7 days of washing, and he shall wash and cleanse on the day of his purification. Whoever has not begun his purification from his fount shall not eat, neither shall he eat in his first degree of uncleanness. All those temporarily unclean shall wash on the day of their purification, and cleanse their garments with water, and shall become clean. Afterwards they may eat their bread according to the law of purity. Whoever has not begun his purification from his fount shall not eat in his first degree of uncleanness. Whoever is still in his first degree of uncleanness shall not eat. All those temporarily unclean shall on the day of their purification wash and cleanse their garments with water, and they shall be clean. Afterwards they may eat their bread according to the law. None shall eat or drink with whomsoever prepares ... and that's the end of the fragment. So there it definitely repeatedly conveys the idea of being clean to eat. Again, we don't have the context of this. It's just a small fragment. So is it talking about all food, or is it talking about holy food? Certainly, if you read the community rule, it definitely has a certain amount of ritual purity that is required in order to eat holy food, in order to eat the pure meal of the community. So that may be the case with this text as well. And then there's another reference from the writings of Josephus. It is in the Wars of the Jews, or Jewish Wars, Book 2, and it's paragraph 129 and 130. Okay, so he talks about them assembling themselves together again into one place, so referring to the Essenes. And when they had clothed themselves in white veils, they then bathed their bodies in cold water. And there's a few references, by the way, that I came across today in a number of different sources, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Josephus, and elsewhere. And I think in another early quote-unquote Christian text or Nazarene text, talks about bathing in cold water. Okay, so they bathe their bodies in cold water. And after this purification is over, then everyone meet together, is how it has it here, meet or meets together, in an apartment of their own, into which it is not permitted to any of another sect to enter, while they go, after a pure manner, into the dining room, as into a certain holy temple, and quietly set themselves down, upon which the baker lays them loaves in order. The cook also brings a single piece of one sort of food, and sets it before every one of them. But a priest says grace before the meat, or before the food. And it is unlawful for anyone to taste of the food before grace be said. The same priest, when he hath dined, says grace again after the meat. And when they begin, and when they end, they praise God, as he that bestows their food upon them. And so it goes on describing this sort of thing. So this is an account by Josephus. Of course, the details here, there are some details which you don't find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like wearing the white garments and so on, but Josephus says it. I forget if Philo says it or not. But that's evidently at least what they did in Josephus' day. Don't know if there's anything like that in the Dead Sea Scrolls which would advocate the idea. There's nothing in what I've read, at least. But you have the idea of ritually bathing prior to eating the meal. So in that case, if the passage that we read from the community rule in 1QS column 5, line 13, which talks about entering the water in order to partake of the pure food, if that is in continuity with what Josephus says, then it would certainly seem to be referring to bathing just prior to eating rather than something at the beginning of entering the community. However, we would have to say that someone entering the community, no matter what, they would have to have some sort of ritual cleansing at some point, whether it was immediately connected with the covenant ceremony or whether it was disconnected from that. At some point, they have to be, very soon, they would have to have some sort of ritual bathing in order to function within the community and to be pure and all of that. So, yeah, those are the references that I found that seem to have some sort of relation to this. And I don't know if that gives us...
Could you give them references again, please?
Sure, I will. I'll just say quick first, I don't know if that gives us a final answer, but I would be interested to hear what people think as to how these statements may relate to what we were reading in 1QS column 3. So the references again, we have 1QS column 3, lines 4 to 6. That's the first one that I read, which refers to the person who refuses to enter the covenant and how they can't be made pure by any ritual washing. And then we have 1QS column 5, line 13, which talks about entering the water in order to partake of the pure meal. So again, that's 1QS column 5, line 13. And then we also have 4Q 514. That's the one that repeatedly spoke of bathing or being ritually pure prior to eating. And then the last one that we looked at was from the writings of Josephus in the Wars of the Jews, otherwise known as Jewish Wars. It's JW is the abbreviation. Book 2, so Jewish Wars, Book 2, paragraph 129 to 130.
Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. So are there any thoughts concerning the statements that we just went through, or if someone has additional statements to add to them? Okay. Are there any other comments in relation to this passage that we've been looking at? And does anyone want to express what seems more likely to them, or if you feel certain or anything like that, in terms of whether it's referring to some sort of water ritual?
They had other water rituals, didn't they? So it wouldn't be unusual.
Well, we definitely know that there was ritual bathing in Judaism at the time, and that Qumran, the Qumran community was certainly involved with ritual bathing. Those of the way, so to speak, who followed the teaching of the teacher of righteousness, again, at the point the community rule was written, were they at Qumran? Did they have mikvahs? I don't know one way or the other. Whether this is referring to a water washing ritual, I don't know for sure yet, one way or the other. However, I will say that entering the community is what the covenant was. And if this is something that we are supposed to do, well, we certainly know, according to the teachings of John the Baptist and of Christ, that we are to be ritually immersed to enter the community. And so if those things are to go together, or basically both of those things seem to be referring to the same point of time. Baptism, so to speak, is when someone enters into the community. The covenant is when someone enters into the community. So they would seem to go together. Whatever this is referring to, if it's referring metaphorically to water or literally, or perhaps better put, if it is using water as a metaphor or simply speaking of literal water, it seems as though either way, in terms of the actual practice of it, that we would have, if this is to be kept, if there was someone entering the community at that time, there would be immersion ritual. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
The church is still practicing it. To enter the church or to become a Christian.
Yeah, they certainly, as you mentioned before, Leroy, it's a common thing in religions to have some sort of water purification ritual. So certainly, still in Christianity, there is a water purification ritual, even though people don't recognize that it has anything to do with ritual purity or anything like that. But I wanted to ask, or I was asking, and I'm interested to hear answers to this particular question. Does it make sense to you guys that if we are to observe this covenant ceremony, that if someone was entering the community, that would be the time that they would have, their quote-unquote baptism or their ritual immersion?
It sure does to me.
Okay.
You're saying if they were joining the branch movement, they would be baptized again, even though they were baptized in some other church, or they didn't know what it was all about?
Well, I'm not really addressing that question one way or the other. It's just saying that if there's someone who is going to be entering into the body of believers, and whether that's supposed to be broader than the branch movement or just singular to the branch movement is another question, which I think is important to talk about. The question is about the timing of it, if that should go with the covenant ceremony. So I guess we can contemplate that more. One of the things that I think will be good for us to keep in mind we should keep this question in mind as we continue to investigate the community rule. One question also is, when does someone become a full-fledged member, so to speak? There is an initiation period of a couple years, according to the community rule. And it takes time for someone in entering the community, for instance, to be able to take part of the Holy Meal, or to partake in the Holy Meal. So would the baptism then be at the beginning of that 2-year period? Would it be at the end? Is the covenant ceremony at the beginning of that period, or is it at the end? Those are things that need to be understood, and perhaps people here have an answer. And if anyone here does have an answer to those questions, then certainly feel free to voice it and to give the references, and we can read them and so on. So actually, I'll ask that first. Does anyone happen to know the covenant ceremony? Does someone enter the community, or basically, if they enter into the community by means of the covenant ceremony, is that to be the beginning of their initiation or the end?
I would say the end.
Yeah, okay, so you're thinking that it's the end. Is there any particular reason why, or does that just make more sense to you? Or?
It seems like, if my memory serves me right, last night we were talking about Ellen White, who's saying that you need to be careful who you baptize. You need to make sure that they understand everything that they're agreeing to or committing to, confessing to, whatever. And then also I would say, it sounds like the ritual of the community rule starting out, anyway, the parts that we've already read seem to be very much like if you have an idol in your heart, then you're cursed. You don't want to enter the community with an idol or something that you're holding on to. So it seems like, if you entered the community, it seems like you'd need to be even. I just assumed that becoming a branch Davidian meant that you were justified by faith. So those are just some of my thoughts. Ed and I have talked about just baptism even in the Seventh-day Adventist Church before. I mean, usually, you've got to go through a whole class, and, you're committing to a lot of things when you get baptized. And we've just been, in the evangelical churches, of course, in the Catholic Church, you're baptized as a baby. In the evangelical church, you're baptized. You just need to say, oh, I want to be a Christian. I believe Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. That's the only confession you really need to make. That's it. And as a Seventh-day Adventist, of course, it's more stringent. So we've just discussed those things in the past. It seems like as my baptisms go along, they seem to be more and more committal,
Very interesting. Yeah, I appreciate those comments. It does remind me of what Josephus says concerning John the Baptist and his baptism. And he kind of says something that we don't really find in the New Testament Gospels. But what Josephus says is that John required people, before baptizing them, to have reformed their lives. And so that would kind of show like some sort of initiatory period or something like that prior to baptism. And so if baptism and the covenant ceremony are to be linked together, then that would seem to put the covenant ceremony at the end of some sort of period like that.
It's something that may back this up potentially. Then the first paragraph of the community rule, talking about the master shall do this and do that. He shall admit into the covenant of grace all those who have freely devoted themselves to the observance of God's precepts, etc. Well, if he's only to admit those who have freely done that, they have to have demonstrated that that is the case. So it implies that there's some time that passes before the covenant is entered into.
I think that's one way to understand it, but I could very easily understand it in a way as well that they have, in other words, he's going to enter them into the covenant, and they're agreeing right then in doing the covenant ceremony that they're giving everything, and then they have the covenant ceremony right then. I could read it in that way too. So it's just whether, I guess one of the issues with that is what does it mean that they have freely devoted, so on and so forth. Does that mean that they have already handed everything over? Does that mean that they have pledged to hand things over? That's kind of, a difference. So.
Okay, well, also at the end of column 2 and beginning of column 3, and I don't know which paragraph this is, but it's the beginning of a paragraph. No man shall be in the community of his truth who refuses to enter the covenant of God so that he may walk in the stubbornness of his heart, for his soul detests the wise teaching of just laws. He shall not be counted among the upright, for he has not persisted in the conversion of his life. His knowledge, powers, and possessions shall not enter the council of the community, for whoever plows the mud of wickedness returns defiled. That also seems to be implying a period of time to determine whether one can or cannot enter into the community. I see what you're saying, though. I understand that the first one could be understood either way, potentially. So I just want to throw this out there, too.
And even this also, it's kind of like, well, either way, whether, in other words, I'm not sure if that would indicate one way or the other if someone basically where the covenant ceremony falls in relation to the initiation period. Because if someone refuses to enter the covenant, let's say the covenant ceremony is at the beginning of a period, and they refuse to enter the covenant, they're still manifesting, that they're not persisting in the conversion of their life. They're still manifesting all of those same things, that they're walking in the stubbornness of their heart and all of that. Although, it makes sense the other way as well. And I think Josephus, I'm not sure if he was going through an actual initiation period or what, but Josephus kind of hung around the Essenes for a while and was kind of maybe on his way to becoming a member. So I don't know if he ever had a covenant ceremony or if he went through an initiation period or anything like that. I don't think he ever became a full member, but he might actually be able to provide information specifically that addresses that. Are there any more comments on this particular aspect?
We're branch candidates, so I was thinking maybe it's some kind of a ceremony at the beginning, because you really don't know what you're getting into when you join something. It takes time to learn what they're all about. Supposedly you should know pretty well before you join up. Anyway, we're branch candidates, so we're on our way to becoming full candidates or not. And it seems like Sister White said, like, I don't know whether you baptize them, but you don't admit them into full membership in the church until they've shown, that they're changing.
Well, okay, so there's a couple aspects there. One, in terms of knowing what we're getting into before getting into it, depending on what the covenant ceremony is supposed to do, that could go either way. So I'm not sure if, that seems to lean more toward the idea of the covenant ceremony being at the end of a period, but not stated for sure. As far as Ellen White and baptism, I don't recall ever reading anything from her that would imply baptizing people and then not bringing them into the church until they've shown that they've reformed. In fact, I think that she states quite clearly that you are not supposed to baptize someone until they have proved that they have reformed. And then and only then can you baptize them. And she then says that baptism is entering someone into the church. It seems like it's like one and the same event.
Yeah, and she has, in the testimonies for the church, she has various testimonies that touch on baptism. One of them is in Volume 6. It's a decently lengthy testimony, and it goes into the various people groups that might get baptized and how to prepare them for baptism and that sort of thing. And so they have to be prepared prior to baptism rather than after baptism. And also parents are specifically counseled to educate their children as to what baptism is and what it will require, that sort of thing, and that the parents are responsible for their children if they have entered prematurely into baptism and that sort of thing. So it's definitely emphasized to do these things prior to baptism.
Mm-hmm. So with all that said, if this covenant ceremony is bringing someone into the body of believers, and if baptism is bringing someone into the body of believers, then they would certainly seem to go together. And in the Didache, for instance, it talks about baptism, having taught someone all these things, the teaching of the two ways, then they can be baptized. So that would seem to put, all all of the various aspects which relate to bringing someone into the community at the end of a period of education concerning the ways of the community. So I think later in the community rule, there's more that speaks more specifically about this, and it might give us a clearer understanding. There are some other questions that I'll mention that are worth investigating. This is, a little bit aside from the community rule itself, but if we are supposed to have a covenant ceremony, and if baptism is to be involved, then these are things that we need to understand. So, one question is baptism or immersion supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime event, a one-time thing? The other question is, let's see the best way to put this. Yeah, is baptism something that is to be officiated by a certain person? And this is kind of a question more about the mode of baptism. Typically, the way that Adventists have practiced this, and many other Christians who practice baptism immersion, is you'll have one person who grabs a hold of another person and dips them backward into the water and raises them up. Is that the proper mode of baptism? Or is someone supposed to dunk themselves under the water? Do you have to fall back? Can you just dip yourself down? Does it matter one way or the other? Are there, is it supposed to be more than one person involved in the actual process of dipping, or does the person dip themselves? These are, I think, very important questions to consider, because, hey, we want to do things the right way. So are there any other comments on those points or on what we've been reading here in the community rule?
Well, maybe I'll just mention this real quick. It's just a reference for people to take note of, and they can look into it later. But in Counsels for the Church, a book, a compilation, I suppose, Chapter 52, Baptism. The title is Candidates to be Thoroughly Prepared. Looks like it starts on page 295, Baptism. And it goes through with various subheadings.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Did you know the page on that volume 6 one also?
No, I don't remember. That was just from memory. I am trying to find it, though. But I haven't seen it yet.
I'm looking through the contents thing, trying to see something that sounded...
Oh, maybe I found it. Yeah, page 90. Let's see. It starts on the bottom of page 91.
Oh, yeah, baptism.
I think I'm going to read a little bit ahead in the community rule from, let's see, this is column 6. Yeah, there are a number of things in column 5 and 6 that speak to the matter of joining the community and so on. You want to mention something?
Yeah, I did. I'm noticing here as I skimmed, I'm remembering now, oh yeah, this one at least in volume 6 of the testimonies, there's a subsection called Examination of Candidates. And as I read it here a while back, I remember thinking, oh, that sounds so much like the community rule.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
The community rule, again, here's one of these documents that at first seemed so extreme and kind of you can read it and think, oh, that's too much. That's, too radical or whatever. That can't be true. This can't be inspired. But then you compare it like we've been doing for the past several weeks or months, and then you realize, oh, well, there's all these other places in the Protestant canon that are way more extreme than the community rule, and we don't think anything of it because it's in the Protestant canon. So, and then here's Ellen White writing. She says, the test of discipleship is not brought to bear as closely as it should be upon those who present themselves for baptism. It should be understood whether they are simply taking the name of Seventh-day Adventists or whether they are taking a stand on the Lord's side to come out from the world and be separate and touch not the unclean thing. So, very similar stuff here. Before baptism, there should be a thorough inquiry as to the experience of the candidate. Let this inquiry be made, not in a cold and distant way, but kindly, tenderly, pointing the new converts to the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world, etc., etc. And then she goes on. It's a very, very important testimony. Everybody should read this, because especially if it has bearing upon entering into the community of present truth.
Absolutely. Okay, so there's a few sections here in the community rule that I think will be good to read in connection with this. It may give an answer. So guide us, Heavenly Family, help us to understand it. So, again, in reading the covenant ceremony, it talks about admitting people into the covenant, and it says 1QS, column 1, line 19. On entering the covenant, that's how it starts out, the covenant ceremony. So this is the covenant ceremony. Admitting someone into the covenant of grace, as the first part of the first column, is equated with bringing them into the community and so on. So it talks about how all those who embrace the community rule shall enter into the covenant before God to obey all His commandments, so on and so forth. And then later, let's see, this is column 5, line 20. But when a man enters the covenant to walk according to all these precepts, that he may be joined to the holy congregation, they shall examine his spirit in community with respect to his understanding and practice of the law, under the authority of the sons of Aaron, who have freely pledged themselves to the community to restore his covenant and to heed all the precepts commanded by him, and of the multitude of Israel who have freely pledged themselves in the community to return to his covenant. They shall inscribe them in order, one after another, according to their understanding and their deeds, that everyone may obey his companion, the man of lesser rank obeying his superior. And they shall examine their spirits and deeds yearly, so that each man may be advanced in accordance with his understanding and perfection of way, one moved down in accordance with his distortions. They may advance each man in accordance with his understanding and perfection of way, or he may be moved down in accordance with his distortions. They shall rebuke one another in truth, humility, and love. Let no man address his companion with anger or ill temper or obduracy or with envy prompted by the spirit of wickedness. Let them not hate him because of his uncircumcised heart, but let him rebuke him on the very same day, lest he incur guilt because of him. And furthermore, let no man accuse his companion before the congregation without having admonished him in the presence of witnesses. Okay, so there it's interesting how someone joins the community, and it says, when a man enters the covenant, to walk according to all these precepts that he may be joined to the holy congregation, they shall examine his spirit. So when he enters the covenant, he's examined, and then he is inscribed. His name is inscribed in the community, in a certain position within the community. And yearly, the person is examined and moved either up or down. So that's rather interesting, the way that this describes it. Then later in column 6, line, this is either 13 or 14. Every man born of Israel who freely pledges himself to join the council of the community shall be examined by the guardian at the head of the congregation concerning his understanding and his deeds. If he is fitted to the discipline, he shall admit him into the covenant, that he may be converted to the truth and depart from all injustice. Okay, so very interesting how every man who freely pledges himself to join the council of the community is examined by the guardian. And if he is fitted, then he is admitted into the covenant. So that shows that someone may pledge themselves before actually going through the covenant ceremony, and then they are examined, and if they are fitted, then they enter into the community by means of the covenant ceremony. And then it says, and later, when he comes to stand before the congregation, they shall all deliberate his case. And according to the decision of the council of the congregation, he shall either enter or depart. So that's interesting because it has him being admitted into the covenant, which it says both in the Thanksgiving hymns and in the first column of 1QS that someone is admitted into the covenant by means of the covenant ceremony. So it's interesting how later, as you know, when they deliberate his case, he either enters or departs based off of their decision. After he has entered the council of the community, he shall not touch the pure meal of the congregation until 1 full year is completed, and until he has been examined concerning his spirit and deeds. Nor shall he have any share of the property of the congregation. Then, when he has completed 1 year within the community, the congregation shall deliberate his case with regard to his understanding and observance of the law. And if it be his destiny, according to the judgment of the priests and the multitude of the men of their covenant, to enter the company of the community, his property and his earnings shall be handed over to the bursar, or the guardian, of the congregation, who shall register it to his account and shall not spend it for the congregation. He shall not touch the drink of the congregation until he has completed a 2nd year among the men of the community. But when the 2nd year is passed, he shall be examined. And if it be his destiny, according to the judgment of the congregation, to enter the community, then he shall be inscribed among his brethren in the order of his rank for the law and for justice and for the pure meal. His property shall be merged, and he shall offer his counsel and judgment to the community. So that had a number of interesting aspects. Mm-hmm. What do you all think of that?
Still scary. Scares me.
Scary, okay. Well, hey, that's, I can relate to that. In other words, when I first read this, it was like, oh man, it just seems like intends being examined and things like that. However, I can't say now, I can't say that I can think of anything about it that's contrary to the principles of truth and righteousness. Are there any other comments on it?
I agree with what you were saying. I can't see anything that doesn't sound right. I'm just curious about the meal of the congregation, and maybe we'll get to that later. It sounds like it's, I don't know, totally separate from other meals or something. I'm not sure. Anyway.
Yeah, even though, we'll definitely deal with that in more detail later. The way that I understand it, and I think it refers to this in column 6. Yeah, column 6, lines 2 or 3 or so. It talks about. It says, "These are the ways in which all of them shall walk, each man with his companion, wherever they dwell. The man of lesser rank shall obey the greater in matters of work and money. They shall eat in common, and bless in common, and deliberate in common. Wherever there are 10 men in the council of the community, there shall not lack a priest among them, and they shall all sit before him according to their rank, and shall be asked their counsel in all things in that order. And when the table has been prepared for eating, and the new wine for drinking, the priest shall be the first to stretch out his hand to bless the first fruits of the bread and the new wine. And where the 10 are, there shall never lack a man among them who shall study the law continually day and night, concerning the right conduct of a man and his companion. And the congregation shall watch in community for a third of every night of the year, to read the book and to study the law and to bless together." So that talks about a certain meal, and it talks about bread and new wine. And those are the significant parts of the meal that are mentioned. There's another text in the Dead Sea Scrolls that is actually written on the same scroll as 1QS. So the scroll that contains 1QS also contains something called 1QSA and 1QSB. And 1QSA is actually a document known as the Messianic Rule, and it talks about the meal of the congregation, and the two significant parts of the meal are bread and wine. So it's very much like the daily. This is actually one of the very striking parallels between the Qumran community and the Nazarenes. It's really, really quite interesting. Now, one of the things that I do want to mention is, I read something from column 5, and then I read something from column 6. In column 5, it talked about entering the community, and when he enters, then he is examined and he is ranked. In column 6, it talks about entering the community and then going through 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, then he is ranked, placed in his rank. I don't know if that's a difference or if column 5 just really summed it up and didn't include this 2-year period. That's one aspect to consider. The other thing that, in other words, those two things that we just read from column 5 in one instance and from column 6 in another, are those two conflicting accounts, or is that one picture, but one is just kind of abbreviated. Now, the other part that kind of goes along with that is that in the various documents, the various manuscripts of the community rule found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are some differences, some of which are major differences. For instance, there's a copy or two of the community rule that do not include the first 4 columns of 1QS. So 1QS is basically kind of like what most people understand to be the standard version. Not that the Qumran community had it as the standard version. Maybe they didn't even have a standard version. But most people today use that as kind of the base text because it's the most complete copy. Well, at least one, maybe even more, of the manuscripts of the community rule actually don't include the entering the covenant parts and the teaching of the 2 ways. It starts with the part after. It starts with basically the beginning of column 5. And then some copies of the community rule actually leave out a huge section that includes some of what we just read, I think in column 5 or in column 6. I'd have to go back and look at the various manuscripts and all of that again. But basically there's different versions of the community rule that include or exclude different parts of what we find in 1QS. And what that may very well indicate is that 1QS is a composite document. In other words, it has many different parts that perhaps originally were independent documents that were at some point put together into one document. The other way of viewing that is that perhaps this was all one document, and then people basically had extracts from that document and had that as a separate scroll. So it's kind of like maybe, you look at Desire of Ages. Is Desire of Ages a compilation? All the chapters of Desire of Ages, were those originally independent works? Were those originally independent works and then they were brought together? Or were they all part of one work and then later people took out a chapter here and there and published it independently? Because you can actually, Seventh-day Adventists in the past and probably in the present have actually published just, a chapter of the Desire of Ages or of the Great Controversy or something else. Or is it both? Because, for instance, as far as I understand, a number of these writings were originally articles that Ellen White wrote for the Review and Herald or the Signs of the Times. I think that's the case with Patriarchs and Prophets and Kings. And then they were later brought together into one book. And then I think even after then, people have published tracts here and there with just, a chapter of a certain larger book that Ellen White wrote. And then you have to deal with the question of, okay, if this is a document that is a composite document, were these originally separate documents that were written by the same individual, or were they written by different individuals at different times expressing different ideas? Obviously, if that's the case, it would make it more important to understand if it is composite, and if so, which part was written by who. So these are all things that we have to consider. One of the implications of that is that if this is a composite document, and if the various parts are written by different people, then the acceptance or rejection of one part would be totally separate from the acceptance or rejection of another part. So, for instance, what we read about the covenant ceremony and the part that we're going to get into with the 2 ways, what's the deal there? Is that separate from the part after it, such as the things that we just read about examination and so on? Maybe. Even the first part and then going into the section on the 2 ways, were those originally separate? Well, maybe. At the beginning of the document that we call the community rule, it says, the master shall teach the saints to live according to the scroll of the community rule. Is the scroll of the community rule that it's referring to the scroll that we're reading when it says that, or is it referring to another scroll other than the one that we are reading? That's a question to ask. That said, the scroll 1QS has written on it Serek HaYahad, the rule of the community. So when it says to teach the saints to live according to the scroll of the rule of the community, and that scroll is labeled the rule of the community, it shows that the people who had it understood it to be the scroll itself. So these are all things to keep in mind and consider. I will mention, though, that I believe in the Thanksgiving hymns it talks about examining, the guardian examining the members before admitting them into the covenant. So even if, let's say, column 5 and 6 were not written by the teacher of righteousness and were written after the time of the teacher of righteousness, that wouldn't mean that it's wrong or that it doesn't accurately represent what took place during that time. Because if it wasn't written by the teacher of righteousness or during his lifetime, it would have to have been written sometime very shortly after that. So any comments on all of that? All right. Well, I know that there are a number of issues involved. There's a lot more to investigate in regard to this. We'll have to continue on. I'm so glad for feasts like this where we can continue on night after night. It helps us to have the continuity. As far as tonight, though, we only have, 5 minutes left in our call, and I, for one, am quite tired. How do you guys feel about closing out? We've been on for almost an hour and a half. For closing out for tonight, looking at things a little bit more, all these various questions that we've had about baptism in general, when is the covenant ceremony in connection with the initiation period, sorry, that was just our phone telling us 5 minutes. All of those different questions that we've been discussing tonight, and then we can come back tomorrow, see if anyone has found answers, and go from there. Does that sound good to everyone?
Yes.
Sounds fine.
That's fine.
Wonderful. All right. Would someone like to volunteer to close off with prayer then?
I will.
Wonderful.
Dear Heavenly Family, we just thank you so much for this time that we could get together and study the community rule. Please give us wisdom as we continue to research on our own into these issues, because we want to know exactly how heaven wants us to conduct ourselves in regard to entering into this covenant and everything that's involved with it. And I just thank you for this fellowship. I thank you for your truth that you give us. I ask you to continue to bless us, and I ask all these things in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Good
night, everybody.
And good night, everyone.
Have a good night. Love you all.
Love you guys. Good night.
Night.
Good night, everybody.